In the winter of 1945, Britain stood among the victors of the greatest war in history, yet the nation itself was breaking under the weight of survival. Bombed cities smoldered beneath gray skies, railways strained to function, factories ran but without capital, fuel, or certainty. Victory had arrived, but stability had not. Inside Whitehall, celebrations gave way to alarm. Treasury officials studied balance sheets that told a grim story. Britain was running out of money, not gradually, but dangerously fast. The state could no longer pay for the peace it had fought to secure. Gold reserves that once anchored British power were depleted. Overseas investments accumulated across decades had been sold quietly during the war. Shipping losses and wartime imports had drained foreign currency. For the first time since the rise of its empire, Britain could not finance itself. This crisis was not visible in public speeches, but it shaped every decision behind closed doors. Britain had fought the war on credit, borrowing food, oil, weapons, and raw materials from abroad. The empire had survived on promises of future payment. Now those promises were being called in. What made the moment unprecedented was not military weakness but financial exposure. Britain was no longer setting the terms. It was asking for them. Across the Atlantic, the United States held the leverage. American factories were intact. Gold flowed into U.S. vaults. The dollar had replaced the pound as the world's most powerful currency. Britain needed dollars to import food, restart industry, and prevent social collapse. Without American support, rationing would worsen. Inflation would surge. The empire itself would begin to unravel. This was the instant Britain realized that victory carried a hidden cost, one that would be paid not through surrender, but through dependence. If you want to understand how empires truly fall, not through invasion but through finance, stay with this story. On the eve of the Second World War, Britain did not look like a declining power. It looked like the financial backbone of the global system. London was more than a capital city. It was the clearinghouse of international trade. Contracts were written there, insurance was priced there, credit was issued there. From South American railways to Asian plantations, British capital underwrote commerce across continents. At the center of the system stood the pound sterling. It functioned as the world's reserve currency, trusted, liquid, and widely accepted. Governments held it. Merchants settled accounts in it. Banks structured their balance sheets around it. As long as the pound held its value, Britain's influence remained unquestioned. The empire reinforced this dominance. Colonies supplied raw materials at stable prices: rubber, cotton, minerals, oil. British factories transformed these inputs into manufactured goods and sold them back across imperial markets. Profits flowed home, financing public debt, military power, and global investments. Even after the devastation of the First World War, Britain still appeared resilient. Its debt was high, but its overseas assets were vast. British investors owned infrastructure, companies, and bonds around the world. These holdings generated income that masked structural weakness. The Royal Navy protected sea lanes, ensuring trade continued uninterrupted. British banks managed capital flows with confidence born of habit and history. The system seemed permanent, but it rested on a single fragile foundation: trust in the pound. Britain assumed it could always meet its obligations in its own currency and that the world would continue to accept it without question. War placed that assumption under unbearable strain. World War II demanded imports on a scale Britain had never sustained. Food, fuel, machinery, and weapons flowed in faster than exports could compensate. To keep the system alive, Britain began converting influence into expenditure. The war would prove that financial power, like military power, could be exhausted, and that once spent, it was not easily regained. On the eve of the Second World War, Britain did not look like a declining power. It looked like the financial backbone of the global system. London was more than a capital city. It was the clearinghouse of international trade. Contracts were written there, insurance was priced there, credit was issued there. From South American railways to Asian plantations, British capital underwrote commerce across continents. At the center of this system stood the pound sterling. It functioned as the world's reserve currency, trusted, liquid, and widely accepted. Governments held it. Merchants settled accounts in it. Banks structured their balance sheets around it. As long as the pound held its value, Britain's influence remained unquestioned. The empire reinforced this dominance. Colonies supplied raw materials at stable prices: rubber, cotton, minerals, oil. British factories transformed these inputs into manufactured goods and sold them back across imperial markets. Profits flowed home, financing public debt, military power, and global investments. Even after the devastation of the First World War, Britain still appeared resilient. Its debt was high, but its overseas assets were vast. British investors owned infrastructure, companies, and bonds around the world. These holdings generated income that masked structural weakness. The Royal Navy protected sea lanes, ensuring trade continued uninterrupted. British banks managed capital flows with confidence born of habit and history. The system seemed permanent, but it rested on a single fragile foundation: trust in the pound. Britain assumed it could always meet its obligations in its own currency, and that the world would continue to accept it without question. War placed that assumption under unbearable strain. World War II demanded imports on a scale Britain had never sustained. Food, fuel, machinery, and weapons flowed in faster than exports could compensate. To keep the system alive, Britain began converting influence into expenditure. The war would prove that financial power, like military power, could be exhausted, and that once spent, it was not easily regained. In 1941, Britain reached the edge of financial exhaustion. Its reserves were nearly gone, its imports depended on American industry, and its ability to continue the war was in doubt. At that moment, the United States intervened with what appeared to be an act of extraordinary generosity. The Lend-Lease program promised Britain access to weapons, ships, fuel, food, and raw materials without immediate payment. Publicly, it was presented as a moral commitment to defeating fascism. Privately, it marked a decisive shift in global power. The United States did not intend for Britain to fail, but it also had no intention of preserving Britain's economic dominance. Lend-Lease was not a gift, it was a restructuring. By supplying Britain directly, Washington bypassed London's financial system. British banks no longer financed global trade. British capital no longer flowed outward. Instead, resources moved one way, across the Atlantic, under American control. In exchange for survival, Britain made concessions that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. The United States gained access to British military bases across the world. Commercial preferences that once favored British firms were dismantled. Imperial trade protections weakened under pressure for open markets. Most critically, Lend-Lease forced Britain to stop acting as a lender. Its overseas investments were sold off to cover costs not included in the program. Loans to other countries ceased. The financial web that had once sustained the empire began to unravel. By the end of the war, the transformation was complete. Britain no longer financed the global system, it depended on it. The nation that had once been the world's primary creditor emerged as its largest debtor. Then, with little warning, the program ended. Supplies stopped. Payment was expected, and Britain, victorious but exposed, was left to confront the consequences of survival purchased on borrowed terms. When the war ended in 1945, Britain expected relief. Instead, it encountered a financial shock. Lend-Lease was terminated almost overnight. Ships carrying food and fuel were halted. Contracts were canceled. A nation that had organized its entire wartime economy around American supply suddenly faced peacetime without it. Britain was unprepared. Its industries needed imports to function. Its population depended on foreign food. Without immediate access to dollars, shortages threatened to turn victory into domestic crisis. With no remaining alternatives, Britain returned to Washington, this time not as a strategic partner, but as a supplicant. The request was no longer for aid, but for a loan. The Anglo-American Loan Agreement of 1946 provided $3.75 billion at low interest. On paper, it appeared generous. In reality, it carried conditions that reshaped Britain's future. Chief among them was currency convertibility. Britain was required to make the pound freely exchangeable for US dollars. This obligation ignored a critical imbalance. Far more pounds existed abroad than Britain had dollars to redeem. When convertibility began, the outcome was immediate and devastating. Foreign holders rushed to exchange pounds for dollars. Britain's reserves hemorrhaged at a speed no treasury could sustain. Within weeks, the policy was suspended. The damage, however, was irreversible. The loan also bound Britain to the new American-led financial system. The dollar was formally elevated to global dominance. British trade preferences were weakened. Imperial economic autonomy dissolved under the weight of international obligation. Britain accepted these terms not because they were favorable, but because collapse was the alternative. The agreement stabilized the economy in the short term, but it ended any realistic path back to imperial independence. The empire was not lost on the battlefield, it was signed away in a contract that ensured survival at the cost of supremacy. In the years immediately after the war, Britain appeared to be stabilizing. Factories reopened, railways were repaired, daily life, though still rationed, resumed a sense of order. To many observers, the crisis seemed to have passed. The government turned inward, prioritizing social reconstruction. The welfare state expanded rapidly. National health care was introduced. Public housing projects multiplied. These reforms reshaped British society and offered real security to millions who had endured years of sacrifice. But beneath this progress lay a fragile reality. Reconstruction was not funded by renewed strength, but by borrowing. Britain's industrial base struggled to compete in global markets. Exports recovered slowly, while imports remained essential. Every gain at home widened dependence abroad. The empire, once the engine of British wealth, no longer covered its costs. Colonial administrations demanded investment, infrastructure required repair, political stability increasingly depended on military presence. At the same time, nationalist movements accelerated. War had weakened imperial authority and raised expectations of self-rule. Britain faced a choice: spend heavily to retain control or withdraw. India's independence in 1947 marked the turning point. It was not only a political event, but an economic one. India had been a central pillar of imperial finance, trade, and manpower. Its departure signaled that the empire could no longer be sustained on limited resources. Other territories soon followed. Each withdrawal reduced Britain's access to raw materials, markets, and revenue. The imperial system contracted, not in chaos, but in stages dictated by affordability. Throughout this period, the pound continued to weaken. Currency crises became recurring events. American loans and support filled the gaps left by imperial decline. Britain had won the war and rebuilt its society. But the recovery concealed a deeper transformation, the shift from global power to managed retreat, from imperial center to dependent ally. By the early 1950s, the cost of Britain's wartime survival could no longer be concealed. What had once appeared as temporary strain hardened into permanent limitation. Britain experienced repeated currency crises as confidence in the pound eroded. Each episode followed the same pattern: capital flight, emergency measures, appeals for external support. The country's global responsibilities, military bases, alliances, and imperial obligations far exceeded what its economy could sustain. Defense spending remained high, but the means to fund it did not. Maintaining forces across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia required dollars Britain did not generate. Every overseas commitment deepened dependence on American goodwill. This imbalance reached its breaking point in 1956, when Britain, alongside France, attempted to reassert control during the Suez Crisis. It acted as though imperial authority still carried financial backing. It did not. The United States opposed the intervention, not militarily but economically. Washington applied pressure through currency markets and international institutions. Support for the pound was withdrawn. Britain's reserves fell rapidly. Within days, the government faced a stark choice: continue the operation and risk financial collapse, or withdraw and preserve what remained of economic stability. Britain chose withdrawal. The decision was swift, public, and humiliating. It revealed a truth that could no longer be denied. Britain could not act independently without American approval. Military strength meant little without financial support. The Suez Crisis marked the psychological end of empire, not because Britain lost territory, but because it lost autonomy. From that moment forward, foreign policy was constrained by balance sheets rather than ambition. The global system had changed. Power no longer flowed from fleets and flags, but from currency reserves and credit access. The financial center of gravity had shifted decisively across the Atlantic. Britain adjusted accordingly, reducing commitments, redefining its role, and accepting a subordinate position within a U.S.-led order. The bill for victory had finally been paid, and it had cost Britain the freedom to act as an empire.